everybody, welcome back to another video. If you're coming back to the channel, thanks so much for coming back. And if you're new, welcome to the channel. My name is Pooja and this is Ready Set Pooja. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave a comment below if you have anything to say about what I had to say today. So without further ado, of course, today's video is going to be my March wrap-up. I actually had a good amount of time to do a bunch of reading this month, so it's been a really good reading month for me. I read 10 books this month, which, you know, for other people that may not be as much, but for me that's kind of crazy. So very excited that I had time to do that, and I'm really excited to talk about all the books that I read with you guys today. So let's just get right into it so this video does not get impossibly long. And yeah, let's just jump right on in. So the first book I have to talk about today is Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi. Now this book was actually shortlisted for the Booker Prize last year, so it had gotten a lot of press due to that, and so a lot of people have already read it. So it's been sort of on the back of my mind ever since then, and I just eventually got around to it when it became available in my local library. And so I picked it up and went through it really quickly because it was so beautifully written. The prose was just absolutely stunning. It's basically about this woman named Antara, who's a middle-aged Indian woman living in the city of Pune, and she's kind of going through this internal crisis because her mother has actually started to develop signs of dementia and Alzheimer's, but she's always had a very fractured relationship with her mother. So it's kind of coming to terms with how do you handle a loved one's decline and, you know, as they're sort of moving towards death when you didn't actually like them as much, even though you kind of have to love them because it's a parent. So I thought just the way that Avni Doshi just handles that kind of a situation and talks about it and shares the internal monologue in Antara's head is just absolutely beautiful. Her world building really just transported me to India. Just an absolutely beautiful book, would highly recommend. Definitely quite sad though, so that was kind of a heavy read to start off the month, but it was really, really great. The second book that I read was Exhalation by Ted Chiang, which is a collection of sci-fi fantasy short stories, and it's actually a pretty well-known book in the sci-fi community, and I was really excited to kind of get into it because I don't really read that much science fiction, and Ted Chiang is obviously a very well-known author, and so I was excited to have the opportunity to read short stories because it was something that I could sort of intersperse in my other reading and didn't kind of have to just go through all at once. I really, really enjoyed how these stories were set up because I felt like the questions they were talking about were very universal societal questions that affect all of us today, but kind of set in these sci-fi or fantasy worlds and situations. So there was this element of really interesting world building of trying to understand, like, okay, what is this setting that the story is set in, but at the same time kind of thinking about these overarching questions that kind of affect all of us today about, you know, do we regret the things that we've done in the past, or is that just kind of a part of who we are? These types of questions that I really enjoyed thinking about in the context of my own life while reading these short stories. The third book I read was In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This book is actually kind of written in the style of many vignettes, all relevant to this symbol of the dream house, and essentially is a memoir that talks about Carmen Maria Machado's experience with domestic abuse in a lesbian relationship, which is actually a topic that you don't really hear much about. And Machado actually discusses this in the book about this conflict of presenting and being honest about moments of abuse in queer relationships, because there's this sense of responsibility of, you know, the queer community is already dealing with so much. Like, is talking about abuse in that community just going to make people think badly of other queer individuals? And so that question was just so interesting to me, and I thought it was so brave of her to be able to kind of put this all into a book and talk about these things that are such difficult topics to talk about, especially when you're talking about yourself and your own lived experience. It was a stunningly written book. I really, you know, found myself connecting to what she was saying. It was a book that I thought was very important to read, and I thought added a lot to my reading this month. The next book I read was Piranesi by Susan Clarke, and this was actually a very whimsical book. It was very interesting. So the basic premise of the book is we have our character who doesn't actually know his own name, but is called Piranesi, and he's kind of the only character in this world that is essentially a giant house of some kind that has endless halls kind of extending in each direction, and he seems to be one of the only people in this world and is kind of spends his days exploring and just sort of figuring out where to get food and things like that. And there's one other person that he knows to be alive in this world called the Other, and there are a few like skeletons that have that he has found and sort of almost worships as other beings that have lived in this world. It's this very interesting transition in the book. We have this alternate reality or fantasy world, but then we start to see, oh, this might actually be more of a psychological thriller than a fantasy. And it's just really a whimsical, interesting book written from the perspective of someone who may or may not be mentally ill. I don't think that question is actually answered because we think the main character may be severely mentally ill, or maybe that is actually a fantasy reality and he's not actually mentally ill. So it's a really interesting fantasy-esque book. The next book I read was The Professor and the Madman by Simon Winchester, which is actually a nonfiction book that details the story of the writing of the Oxford English Dictionary. And it kind of follows two primary individuals, which are James Murray, who was sort of the guy at Oxford who really pulled together the English dictionary, as well as the Madman, or William Chester Minor, who was a surgeon in the US Army, kind of went insane in that process, ended up in a mental asylum in the UK after murdering someone. However, while he was in asylum, actually contributed a significant amount of the words and definitions that were eventually included in the Oxford English Dictionary. So it was this really interesting exploration of a fascinating historical story that not many people really know about. And it's interesting because today we use the Oxford English Dictionary so often for just looking up words, but we never kind of think about, oh, this must have been such an Herculean task to pull together the first dictionary. Like, how do you even do that? And Simon Winchester really goes through that whole process of how difficult it was to come up with the first few English dictionaries and what that process kind of looked like. And then also this really interesting story of the relationship of these two men, one of whom was certifiably mad, but contributed so much to our current literary lexicon today. So really interesting story that was a fun read for me to kind of just go through. Next, I have The Refugees by Viet Nguyen. This book is actually a collection of short stories. Viet Nguyen is known most for his book The Sympathizer, which won the Pulitzer Prize a few years ago. I have actually not read The Sympathizer, but I wanted to start off with this book because, again, it was a collection of short stories, so it's easy to sort of intersperse with while reading other books. I really found this to be a very enlightening story. So all of the stories kind of deal with people who in some way are related to the country of Vietnam. That's sort of the nexus force in this collection, if you will. And I thought this was just a fantastic book that really kind of details these everyday problems and everyday issues when there's this added layer of all this past trauma and kind of how that plays into the lives of these characters. I thought that that was a really interesting way to present these stories, very beautifully done, and a book that I really found to be quite enlightening. The next book I read was The Inland Sea by Madeleine Watts. This is actually a book by an Australian author, and I believe this is her debut novel, so that was a cool thing to be able to read, and I really, really enjoyed this book. So the premise of this novel is it goes around our main character, who is actually she's a graduate of English literature, but is working as an operator for Australia's 911 center, which is actually, I think, 000 in Australia. And she kind of has to hear all these stories of people who are calling with emergencies, obviously, but she's kind of the one who's at the switchboard connecting them to the police or the firemen or the ambulance or whatever. And it kind of details her personal stories with her relationship with a man in her life, her relationship with her family, and how that kind of plays into who she is today with some of her childhood friends and how that kind of plays into this. And it's interesting because it really kind of is all against against the backdrop of climate change and global warming and how that's affecting Australia as a country. And what I thought was really interesting about the way that this is presented is it kind of shows her in this role as an emergency switchboard operator, hearing a crisis every few minutes. And she sort of starts to become very detached from that. And it becomes like, oh, these people are literally possibly dying on the other end of the line. But for her, it's like, oh, it's just another call, because you have to kind of put it into that perspective in order to survive your day-to-day life as a 911 operator. But it's interesting because that's also a metaphor for how many of us have started to now think about climate-related crises. Like every day there's a fire somewhere or a tornado somewhere or a hurricane somewhere. And while all of these things are absolutely crises and things that demand our attention, we've just become fatigued with hearing about all of them and are now just like, oh, that's just a part of our lives, when we really should be treating them with more urgency and actually making efforts to curb some of these issues. But as a society, we've just become desensitized to the urgency of these crises. So I thought it was a really interesting way to present that. And it also really builds in a lot of interesting Australian history that I didn't know about. So a very beautifully done novel, and a really interesting way of bringing in this major societal issue that we're all dealing with today, while kind of weaving that into the story of a very interesting character. The next book that I read was Cracking India by Bapsi Sidhwa, who is a Pakistani author. She is actually a Parsi author, which is a really interesting perspective that I had not really read about before. So essentially this book deals with the story of a family living through the partition of India and Pakistan during the independence movement. It is a Parsi family living in Lahore, which is part of modern-day Pakistan. And it's a perspective, again, that you don't really hear about as much when you think about partition. It's typically framed as this issue that's kind of a triad between Hindus in India, Muslims in Pakistan, and the British. And you don't really hear about the stories of minorities like Parsis and Christians and Jews and other people that were still a part of the South Asian subcontinent, but aren't really considered main actors in that whole story. So it's a really devastating novel told from the perspective of a child, actually, which was a very interesting decision because it really elucidates sort of the senselessness of the violence that happened during this time period. And just a stunningly written novel. Absolutely, loved this book. Very difficult to read again because it deals with obviously a lot of violence and sectarian violence, things like that. Absolutely stunning novel. And Bapsi Sidhwa actually has a few more books, so I'm really excited to pick up some of these. And I actually picked up this Bapsi Sidhwa book on the recommendation of Nashwa, who has a channel on BookTube as well, which I will link below for you to check out because I absolutely love her recommendations and the way she talks about books, and she is an amazing Pakistani booktuber. So thank you to her for this recommendation. The next book I read after taking a break from some of these very heavy topics was Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. This book was just a fun, light type of thing to add to my reading that I really enjoyed. So the basic storyline here is it's a love story that details the relationship between the son of the first female president of the United States as well as the Prince of England. And it's fun. It's a romance story kind of detailing how they overcome the odds to really show their love to the world, and just a really heartwarming story. Really enjoyed that, and it was a nice thing to build into my reading after reading a lot of really, really heavy literature, as I was just saying. So loved the book, loved the characters. They were all very endearing. Obviously with like a rom-com type of book, it's not super realistic, but I think it did a great job of sort of feeling very relatable, and just a really cute story, and really enjoyed that one. And then the last book that I read this month was Blowout by Rachel Maddow. I actually listened to the audiobook of this book, and Rachel Maddow actually won a Grammy for this audiobook, so I would highly recommend listening to it. It is quite long though, it's about 16 hours, and she basically is doing sort of an expose on the oil and gas industry and how it's kind of related to political issues involving Russian meddling in the American elections, for example, as well as the recent hegemony that they've tried to establish in Eastern Europe, and sort of the political repercussions of their dependence on oil as their primary industry of the country. And so it's a really interesting look at historically how the oil and gas industry has risen to the point it is at today, where you know, they're kind of propagating all these climate disasters and not paying their fair share of taxes, and how that's all kind of come to be. The research is impeccable in this one. She really kind of has explored every possible angle there is to explore, which is why I guess the book is so long. But she has a really great way of telling the story in a very sort of cinematic fashion, so it's not something that's like very difficult to understand how all these things are connected, and you really feel like you're almost listening to a novel more so than a nonfiction book, but really enjoyed that one, learned a lot from it, and feel like it's an important book for anyone really to be reading in the 21st century, so would recommend. Those are all the books that I read this month of March. It was a great reading month again for me, since I got through 10 books, which is a lot for me. So I was really happy to have had all this time to read this month. Let me know what your thoughts are on some of the books that I talked about today, if any of them strike your fancy, or if you've read any of them, what your thoughts were on them. I didn't actually dislike any of the books that I read. I enjoyed them all quite a lot. That's all I have for you guys today. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys next time. Have a good one, and bye-bye.